Okay, thank you very much. So this is not the kind of standard, can everybody hear me? Standard talk I give, but it's more focused on the sort of methodological, ethical, operational challenges that one faces doing RCT. So to do that, what I've done is I've focused on one example, which is the first RCT I did, starting in 2006. I've done a number since, because I think it demonstrates many of the value as well as the challenges of these things. So I'll try to be focusing both on the challenges and the value. So in many ways, RCTs are new to economics, or relatively new, but they're kind of exponential. So there was very few, and now there's been sort of exponential growth in both the number and influence of RCTs. And I think if you think about the history of why that was the case, is that obviously RCTs have been going on for a long time in many other areas apart from economics. But the real breakthrough in economics was actually people going into the field and spending time in the field. And just as an example, there's a gentleman called Chris Udry, who I know very well, who was quite exceptional because he spent almost 2 years in northern Nigeria studying how credit markets were arranged. So for example, if I get a shock, like a bad rainfall shock, what happens to the terms of credit with the person who's given me money? Interestingly, it was not an RCT. It was field research. It was very much like anthropology. But that sort of opened people's eyes to the sort of value of going and observing up close what was happening in these credit markets. And then following that, a whole group of people, some of which you may know, Esther Duflo probably being the preeminent one, sort of took this idea, really the combination of field research and randomized controlled trials. And that's where sort of the magic happened. Because they suddenly realized that you could apply this methodology to a whole bunch of areas of policy which people wanted to know the answers to the kind of policy impact question. And the reason it was so attractive is that in economics, before this, you would spend almost all your time trying to show that you had the effect was identified. Suddenly that you didn't have to do that. You just put treatment in, you show there's a balance table, and people sort of believe that you've shown impact. Okay? Now, where I'll come to at the end of the talk is not that this is the magical solution to all policy design questions, because it certainly is not. But it is a useful sort of bit of the toolbox, which economists are increasingly applied. Another thing that's happened is that there's been a huge surge in the kind of units coming out of universities that focus in part on RCTs, but involve frontier researchers going into the field, working with policymakers, designing RCTs and other types of evaluations. And for example, there's the one that I direct at the LSE, which is funded by DFID, JPAL at MIT, Innovation for Poverty Action at Yale, SEGA at Berkeley. What's interesting is that the latter three are entirely focused on RCTs. So that is all they do. International Growth Center is a little bit more Catholic, lots of different methodologies and so forth. But it gives you some sense of how important this revolution has been, because these are big units, many, many millions of pounds a year type units. Okay, so what is this talk going to be about? Well, it's going to be about using a specific intervention. So at least for myself, I find I'm clearer if I'm focusing on something specific, to sort of understand some of the key methodological, operational, and ethical issues that apply to. And that example is a large program in Bangladesh, which is designed to reach essentially the poorest women in rural areas. And these women, which is characteristic of many of the poor in South Asia, are predominantly doing casual wage labor at the time they're sort of found. And the program is essentially trying to transfer capital and other inputs to them so that they move into self-employment. So if you look at the distribution of labor market activities in a Bangladeshi village, the very poorest are doing basically two things. They're either ag laborers or they're maids. The third category are beggars. These are all basically spot markets. If there's work, it's like a sort of 0 hours contract or something. If there's work, then they give you work for that day. But it means that you don't work for a very large chunk of the year. So paradoxically, the poorest people in the world are not working all the time. There seems to be some sort of surplus labor problem. So by injecting this capital, and then if you look at the richer women in the same villages, they're doing stuff like livestock, taking care of cows, taking care of goats, poultry, that sort of thing. So it's basically trying to move these women into doing self-employment, so you fill in those days when they're not working, right? The interesting thing from the perspective of this meeting is that there was enormous resistance to any RCT. So when I visited in 2006, I went around villages with an interpreter. I kind of picked off lists of women who had been in the pilot version of this program. When I interviewed them, sort of trying to figure out whether anything had happened. And then I went back to Dhaka. And when you think of an NGO, you don't think of BRAC. BRAC is apparently the biggest NGO in the world. And if you go to Dhaka, literally the BRAC building is a skyscraper with one floor devoted to research. So it took about a year to convince them that it was worth doing an RCT. And the key problems were twofold, and this is common pretty much to all RCTs. The first is the operational people, the people who are trying to help these poor women by expanding their program, don't want to do it. Because they say that's going to hinder the operational objectives of the program. Why? And the second, which is an even bigger hurdle, is unethical. Why would you leave some women purposely without the program whilst granting it to a randomly picked set of other women? And that's a difficult question to answer. And the way we answered it is you have a budget, and we will spend your budget on the condition that you have enough budget. Then when it comes to 2011, so we're thinking about a baseline in 2007, 2-year follow-up in 2009, and then 4-year in 2011, all the women who were not treated in 2007 would get the program. And that's one way to square the circle. It's not the only way, but it certainly was the only way that BRAC was willing to do this randomized controlled trial. Okay, so the other thing that's really, really important in these things is you have interested parties within the organization that wants to find the answers that you're helping them find. If you don't have that, it's pretty much a non-starter. So I've had, several full starts where often somebody else says they really should know the answer to this, but actually the people in the organization don't care, and then they'll fail, almost by definition. But in this case, there was a couple of people, Imran Matin, who was then head of the BRAC research, so he was running that whole floor, who then went on to be head of BRAC Africa, and is now head of international programs at Save the Children in London. So he was critical because he had PhD, he sort of saw the value of this stuff, he knew a little bit about what we were doing. And then even more important was Mushtaq Chowdhury, who I'd known for other reasons, work I was doing on health, who was important enough to say at an organizational level, we want to do this, and overall all the operational resistance. Okay? And that relationship has continued to this day. So indeed, we're having a huge conference at the LSE in December, where we're going to not only be showing these results, but there's been, some of you may have seen this science paper, which has the 6 basically pilots of the same program in 6 different countries, which I'll come to at the end of the talk. But it's critical to notice that there's a joint interest in getting it done. Because why do they want to know the answers to this question of whether the program works? Well, fundamentally because it's an organization set up to improve the welfare of people in Bangladesh, but also because they run by getting money to fund these programs. And to show somebody who's a potential donor that some person at the LSE or the UCL or whatever has done this study and has shown that the program works, that's something that's very, very valuable to these organizations. Now, of course, it's risky. Well, what if you find out it doesn't work? So if you think about how evaluation has changed, at least in my sort of professional career, I used to have people come through my office and say, listen, we want you to be a consultant on evaluation. We're doing something in Malawi. and we're convinced that it works. And this is the evidence. We reached this many people, we did this, I've been there, I sort of felt the people were better off. And you think, well, that doesn't sound right. You know, of course, you know, you're biased to thinking you're doing something. Otherwise, why on earth are you spending your time giving out cows or microfinance or whatever, the rest of it? And what's really interesting is if you look about some of the very big ideas, I mean, this idea is getting very big now, but the really big idea that preceded it in the sort of getting to the poorest people was microfinance. Microfinance, when it came out, people were claiming the world for it. And now, you know, the recent stuff, which is, again, replicated studies and a number of studies, are basically showing two important facts. One, it does not really fundamentally affect living standards in a meaningful way. It does affect businesses, but only if you've been running a business already. It doesn't lead to the creation of new businesses. So it's not transformational in the way that people were thinking when the idea was out there, and there was some theory behind the idea, right? So these evaluations in some ways are important because they determine where the flows of money are going to go. And I think this is one where we're trying to be sort of very careful because we don't want to get into the sort of microfinance overhype where we think we're going to sort of lift everybody out of poverty. I mean, there were these words like the microfinance revolution, the miracle of microfinance, et cetera, and that's now been scaled back to something much more realistic. Now, to make these things happen, you need a lot of money. And in this case, we were living off DFID's largesse in the sense that they had been doing some of the funding with other bilaterals. And within the programmatic funding, there was an evaluation percentage, which then DFID took and gave, well, spent in terms of doing the surveys. And these are, as I'll come to in a second, were very, very large surveys. They took about 6 months in the field to complete the surveys. And the reason for that is the way we did this is we decided that if you were going to give something close to 10% of the women in a village a large transfer of capital and training, so typically 2 cows is the median transfer. So that would be like 10 times their initial livestock assets. That's going to have effects beyond the women, right? So then we want to look what happens to the people who are poor but not selected, the people in the middle part of the distribution, the people at the top of the wealth distribution, what's going to happen to prices, all these sort of general equilibrium effects, which meant that unlike most randomizations in economics, we couldn't just do it by randomizing within the village. We couldn't go and say, here are all the households, put them in an urn, pull the ones, and then give a certain subset of the eligible a couple of cows. Okay? So it costs a lot of money, and the other thing that's important is there's a large and increasing amount of work that you have to, if you want to maintain that good relationship with the partner, in this case BRAC and to some extent DFID, you have to do a lot of dissemination work. So I present like stuff about this maybe 10 times a year in different keynotes, that sort of stuff, because they want the word out there. I mean, of course, if I found nothing, they may not be so pushy in terms of wanting to sort of get me on a plane and present this stuff. So to give you a little bit of context, and I know that we don't want to focus on sort of results, but to give you a little bit of context of what this covered, because this now is moving into the sort of design bit of it. Fact one, this was not our idea. BRAC had been experimenting for years to come at a means of reaching these women. So imagine you're an agricultural laborer in a Bangladeshi village. So if you're in that position, you're not really going to have any demand for capital, right? 97% of our women are illiterate. They're about median age of 40. They all have children. So they're not women who are going to be going to the garment factories in Dhaka. They're kind of stuck in the village, and by all sorts of criteria, they're extremely poor. So about 50% are below the $1 a day poverty line. So the question is, what on earth do you do with these people? They're not even coming to, microfinance is everywhere in Bangladesh, but none of these people are even showing up and wanting to borrow money because they have no use for it. And so what they're doing is in part kind of both providing capital, but also providing support to employ that capital in a way that is already in effect being employed in the village, but by women which are far richer than these women. So what we did is, since we knew we wanted to do the randomization at a kind of village level, we decided the best way to do that was to randomize at the branch level. So I think there's a map here. So we used sort of poverty mapping to figure out where the poorest sub-districts in Bangladesh were. And then the red dot is a control village, the green dot is a control BRAC office. And then a BRAC office covers about 8 kilometers in terms of diameter, and then all the villages in that get treated in the green radius, and then all the ones in the red don't. But they're sufficiently far apart that they don't, you don't overlap. And this is because it's very, anybody who knows Bangladesh, they're very widely different, these sub-districts. Some are very, close to the coast, some are a lot of rivers, very different soil conditions and so forth. And then what we did is we, as I already said, we were no longer focusing on a pilot program. So the science paper, which some of you is all pilots. So basically the World Bank came up with money to copy this program in, I think, in 10 countries, of which 6 sets of results have come in, right? And so this is different because this is a program they were already expanding. So today it's reached about 1 million women in Bangladesh, and we were constantly feeding them results, both to kind of change a little bit the design, but also to show the world that actually that what they were doing, even at the 2-year mark, was having an effect, right? And then that was used to attract more money to expand the program, and interestingly, to other countries. So this is an interesting case of an idea that originated in Bangladesh that is now sort of traveling the world. And interestingly, not just through BRAC. So BRAC is doing it in other countries. So part of the evaluation is looking at these types of programs in sub-Saharan Africa, which we're involved in. But for example, another project we're involved in is the Punjab Livestock Department is copying this program in Bangladesh. And there's all these sort of changes in design, like if you give them cash instead of assets, does that have any effect? What are the long-term effects? What are the general equilibrium effects? What if you unpackage the training from the asset transfer? And that's all informing where money goes to in terms of policy. Okay. So I'll give you, I think, basically no results, maybe 2 minutes of results, just to sort of show. And I think the easiest way is this rather simple plot. So what you can see here is a couple of interesting things. If you're interested in labor markets in rural areas, it's very interesting. So basically, the red bit is livestock rearing. So that's the main focus of the program. That's cows and goats. And interestingly, they had a much larger choice. So they could have chosen vegetables for retail. They could have chosen petty trading. They could have chosen nursery. But they all seem to choose livestock. And that's interesting because that's precisely what the richer women are doing. So these 1 to 4 are wealth classes. So what you see basically is as you move, so this is just at baseline, the graph to the left. That's 2007, and the graph to the right is 2011. So what's interesting there is that the poor women, as I was saying, are mainly in casual wage labor, either as maids or as agricultural laborers. And that accounts for over 90% of the hours they work in a year. And on top of that, the most frequent occupation is begging. Okay, so they're 97% illiterate. These are very, very poor people. As you move across, and never mind the effect of the program, we're just still on the left graph, as you move into the more wealthy, and interesting, this is wealth classes as determined by the community. So what happens is you get the basics, it's sort of a census of all the information of the households, and then you meet and do this participatory ranking, where you basically throw into different bins, classifying people as extreme poor, poor, middle, and rich. But notice that even in the rich category, 10% of the women are below the $1 a day poverty line. So it's not, we're not talking about what we would consider sort of rich people or middle class. It's just within that distribution in the village. But interestingly, look at the people on the right, so the women who are classified as middle or rich. What they're doing is basically livestock and poultry. They basically are refusing to do any wage labor because obviously wage labor is unattractive for a variety of reasons. So when you look at the effect of the program, the poorest women, so the extreme poor is 1, that's the target group. Yeah. What basically happens is they whack out the number of hours in livestock. That's the big effect. So what's really happening here is a kind of a revelation that these women were underemployed. So interestingly, at baseline, they're working 2 months less in terms of days than the people in the middle and the top. And when the program comes in, they're basically filling all those days where they work, because of course, if you have a cow, you have to work every day to some extent. And they're increasing dramatically the top bar, which is the livestock bar. So they're 40% richer, which is a huge effect, but it's because they're doing so much more labor. The actual earnings per hour are not increasing very much. The main effect is on the extensive margin. They're just working more. And so, they're kind of working themselves out of poverty to some extent. And there's endless effects on poverty, expenditure, which I will not go into because I know that's not the focus here. But what's interesting here is you can sort of see the value of all the money we spent. So as of 2011, the evaluation is costing about £1.3 million, just the evaluation. And the value of that is you see exactly what's happening to not only everybody else in the village, but you can also look at things like aggregate effects. So this is just as an example, these are all landless women at baseline, but we're still beginning to see them starting to own land, to rent land. So you get a sense, so there's a sort of a savings and capital accumulation story, which suggests after 4 years that they're really in a different circumstance than they were at baseline. And remember, and I don't think I told you, that all assistance stops after 2 years. You do everything in 2 years, and then you stop. And so this really does look, they're holding on to their assets, they're growing their assets, the number of cows and so forth, and they're beginning to get land, they're beginning to save much more. Okay, so they're beginning to kind of resemble more the middle part of the wealth distribution in these villages. Okay, so let me, and then these are just some aggregate effects on labor supply, so you can look at the village level effects. Okay, so let me conclude just with a few small remarks on RCTs. So I think we don't want to be, I guess my main point is we do not want to be carried away into thinking that we're going to completely answer all policy questions using RCTs. Okay, so my main focus is improving living standards, increasing economic growth. Roughly put, the big declines in poverty, the big improvements in living standards in the developing world have taken place in countries where economic growth has occurred. Do I think we can answer all the questions about how to create growth through RCTs? Well, clearly not, right? So if you think about macroeconomic policy, that's a very difficult area to get a sort of RCT into. If you think about exchange rate policy, even if you think about infrastructure, are you really going to get somebody to randomly build, railways in some places, roads in other places? Probably not, right? So all these big areas where you think that there's some relation to growth, and even in education, you can probably do some things on the margins of, for example, incentivizing teachers and not incentivizing teachers, incentivizing students to go to school through conditional cash transfers and so forth. So you can pick around, but you're probably not going to do an RCT on a completely changing an education system, which may be what's required in order to really bump up the levels of education. So one thing, actually, I think I'll come back to this and just say one, so we continue. So we can't cover everything, and at the moment, my feeling is that the RCT thing is still trapped in the micro, right? So if you think about, the 4 areas, for example, the International Growth Center is interested in, which is the state effectiveness, firms, energy and energy and cities. We do have RCTs in all those areas, but the bulk of the work in those areas are non-RCT work. And so there is this trade-off between identification, which is important, and relevance. And by relevance, I mean relevance to policymakers of the stuff you're finding. And often I feel that there's a kind of disconnect between the perfectly identified experiment and what the policymaker may want to know, which is typically something fairly quick and talking about a broad area of policy, which is not limited to a very tiny intervention. So I think there's a need to sort of push micro and macro together. And indeed, we're seeing that. So we are now starting to see RCTs in areas like taxation, in terms of firms, in terms of urban services. So it is happening. RCTs are, but I think what we don't want to lose sight of is they're just a methodology. There's nothing magical about them. They're just giving you better identification if you can implement them in a setting where you're getting relevant information for concerned parties. So I wanted to just sort of push that out as being, I guess, the bottom line for me. They're important, but they're not going to, solve all our policy problems. And then just to sort of end on one thing, which is this whole scaling up question. Where are we? Okay, so I think one thing that is happening increasingly, and we saw this with microfinance, and now we're seeing it with the ultra poor program, is replication is really, really important. Because who knows, you take your program to Ghana, even if it's BRAC in Ghana, will it work? You don't really know. And if it isn't BRAC, I mean, I personally really like BRAC. I think they're amazing at implementing stuff. But what if it's some partner that's not so good at implementing stuff? Then it's very difficult to distinguish, well, is it the program design problem, or is it the implementing partner not very good? So these sorts of things, like this science paper that takes the same thing I was just describing to you to 6 countries, so not necessarily the same animals, but basically the same. They all go to kind of BRAC school, learn how to do it. They go to Dhaka, learn how to do this like they used to do with microfinance. Then they go out and do it. And these are basically NGOs, governments, and so forth. What's interesting is you look at the results. So this is like pooled. I don't know what's the best one to look at. Consumption, I guess, or something like that. There's really quite a lot of evidence that that's being pushed up in these 6 countries. And if you break it out by country, again, you're seeing sort of, on the whole, fairly significant and positive effects from these programs. So I guess the evidence is massing in their favor, but there's still going to be one thing that you can do in terms of tackling poverty, maybe a relatively important thing. But what's valuable here is that the partner and the evaluator, in this case drawn from universities, are both interested in the answers to those questions, and then you begin to replicate it, and you begin to sort of form some picture of how well this works in different contexts, which then informs where money flows to in these countries.